Hey, what is up guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome to Hot Wheels Unleashed 2. So it is full launch day today and this game already has some premium day one DLC, which I'm not usually a big fan of. However, I can definitely see where they're trying to appeal this pack to. This is the AcceleRacers All-Stars Pack, which features 4 cars. You've got Carbide, Audio 9, Rollin Thunder, and then also SpecTyte. This is a decent selection of cars and I'm going to individually review each and every single one of them and give you my honest thoughts and opinions. So let's head over and have a look at the car models themselves. We have the RDO9, which is a balanced legendary. Now this is probably the pick of the bunch. Just in terms of its stats alone, it's insanely good. However, I did already think that this car was already in the game, so maybe I'm getting it confused with something else. But overall, this is definitely a very, very good car, especially in terms of its stats and just overall appeal. Now we also have SpecTyte. This is again a balanced legendary variant, but it's definitely a lot weaker than the RDO9. This is a decent car, and at first I really just couldn't get used to the design, but definitely it's grown on me as I've used it more and more. Then we also have Carbide. This is probably the weakest one of the bunch. This falls into the rocket category. It's supposed to be very, very quick on the straights, which it kind of is, but overall it just feels like a very, very weak car, and it doesn't really excel at, well, anything really. Probably time trials is the best place to use this thing, but even then you'll have to be putting a ton of upgrades on it to make it, well, anywhere near competitive. And then another amazing one from the pack. This is an off-road variant. It's a legendary once again, and it is Rollin Thunder. Absolutely love the design of this thing. Whilst its stats probably make it overall the weakest, it's definitely not going to be affected by going on things such as the grass, the floor, etc. To be honest, I really, really like the design of this thing. It's definitely up there as one of my favourites from the pack. Now let's talk about the RD09 first, because I think this is definitely going to be the standout of the entire pack and the go-to. Now this falls in the balance category, but to be honest, I'd certainly say it's much better than just being balanced. It's pretty much phenomenal at absolutely everything. It's insanely quick, it's insanely good at drifting, handling, and it's very, very good on its acceleration. It literally does not have a single down point, and that's a little bit worrying because I could definitely see a lot of people getting in this thing online and basically winning absolutely everything. It really doesn't have a weak point to this vehicle, whether you're using it in the likes of waypoint, time trials, or things such as races and eliminations. This thing is going to be the pick of the bunch, and I would just say in terms of its stats alone and how it felt whilst I was using it, this thing, yeah, it's pretty much going to be one of the most unbeatable cars in this game, no doubt. Which is a bit of a shame at the same time, because obviously it's a premium DLC and it does kind of feel like, out of all of the cars I've used in this game so far, this thing just doesn't have a weak side at all, meaning that one of the best cars on day one is one that you're going to have to fork out extra money for. So I don't really know how I feel too much about that one. It's like, okay, yeah, I mean, I personally own the pack. I bought the legendary edition, but for those that might have just bought the standard edition and will have to fork out now more to get one of probably the best cars in the entire game, it's a bit of a shame that this obviously came day one alongside the full launch of the game as well. But from a standpoint of it being a vehicle in this game, this is definitely up there as one of my favourites so far in the early game. Literally, like I said, it doesn't have a weak point. It's very good at drifting, it's very good at time trials, waypoints, races, elimination. You can literally use this car for any of the events and it will perform well no matter what. It will probably exceed in the majority of them. I found that for some reason this thing is just insanely good with its drift events, which means that they become almost too easy, as well as like the likes of races, because it has a very, very good acceleration, top speed, and very, very good handling. It pretty much beats anything on a racetrack. There is just no comparison. This is the best car of the bunch, hands down, and honestly this car alone probably makes the pack worth the asking price if you're wanting a car that just does it all. So SpecTyte up next. This is again a balanced vehicle. Now to be honest, this is, whilst it's a okay vehicle, it certainly doesn't do amazing in, well, anything apart from really the handling. The handling is quite nice on it, but in terms of its top speed, boost and stuff, it's just not that great at anything. Definitely one of the weaker ones of the bunch. It's not my least favourite, I'll kind of explain that a little bit later on. But just in terms of the overall vehicle feel, how competitive it is, it just doesn't feel that good at anything. Maybe that'll change when it's fully upgraded, but to be honest, just because of how, I mean, not great at everything it felt when I was using it at first, it's probably not one I'll look into really upgrading. Like I said, handling's probably the best thing about it. In terms of its acceleration, speed and such, it's just not that good, and will probably get beat by a lot quicker vehicles in this game. In terms of its design and stuff, you know, I get a lot of people love the AcceleRacers and stuff like that, but for me, it's just a bit of a poor design. It's just a bit of a weak one as well. Whilst it looks much better at the front than it does the rear it just kind of looks far too basic, especially when it's kind of transferred into sort of video game form. I'm just not a fan of the looks of this thing. It's a mix between sort of a four-wheel drive and a, you know, kind of Formula 1 racer. It just doesn't look quite right. It did grow on me over time, but it's definitely not going to be something that I'm going to sit there and say, well, that's definitely one of my favorites. SpecTyte, not too bad. Now let's move on to what I honestly would class as the weakest of this entire pack. This is Carbide. Now this one right here, it's a very simplistic design. Now obviously a lot of these cars are, I believe, from like 2005 with the AcceleRacers and such, and yeah, when it comes to just the design of this one, I've never really been a fan of it, and I can't say I'm a fan of it when it's kind of transferred over. It's just very basic looking. I feel like the Hot Wheels franchise itself has gone on to make very similar cars a lot later that are just a lot better looking than this thing. So from a design standpoint, it's definitely the weakest of the bunch, and definitely in terms of its performance as well, probably the weakest of the bunch. It falls into the rocket category, but in all honesty, it's just really not that fast in terms of its overall pace. Its handling is very nimble and it feels very lightweight and nimble, but to be honest, it's mainly a disadvantage, because if you're going to be using this thing in races, which is where I kind of recommend it originally, or at least I was going to aim to recommend it there, it's just going to get knocked about like no tomorrow. I find that the best thing for this vehicle is probably time trials. That nimble handling really does help on some of the more complex tracks, but to be honest, it's certainly not my favorite. It's probably the weakest of the bunch. I'm not a fan of the design, I'm not a fan of the way it feels, and I'm just sorry, this one just falls quite flat for me. So the Carbide, I just cannot go ahead and really rate it. For me, it's bottom of the pack. It just feels like a kind of last minute addition, and I'm just not a huge fan of it. Maybe if it just had some better stats overall and a bit more than its nimbleness, that could be a better vehicle. So let's move on to Rollin Thunder. Now this one sits in the off-road category. Obviously it's got the typical SUV design and such, and it's definitely a design that appeals to me. It's a much more detailed model. You feel like there's a lot more going on than the likes of the you know, Carbide and such. It is just a better model overall. So from a design standpoint, I think they've done a fantastic job of this one. You know, it just looks detailed even when it's kind of transferred into a, you know, a game form. I think it's a fantastic model. In terms of its, you know, specs and handling and such, how does it perform? Well, to be honest, it's good. it's quite bulky compared to the rest of the pack, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It definitely separates itself from the others just from being very heavy, very bulky, very good in races, because you essentially can just bash everyone else out of the way, which isn't necessarily a downside, and as soon as you get on the floor, this thing's just going to have no problems at all. It definitely suits a vehicle. That's kind of its thing, is the fact that it can just go around on the floor, no problem, not get any slowdown, and especially when it comes to the likes of traps and stuff, it's not going to struggle very much there either. Overall, this is probably my second favourite of the pack behind the RD09, and definitely a standout vehicle when it comes to this AcceleRacers pack. I really do like this vehicle, and I'm quite surprised that I do, because usually I'm not a fan of these bulkier vehicles. Most of the time they just feel quite useless unless you're kind of forced to use them by the game. But, you know, in terms of being an overall decent vehicle, having a nice weight, having decent speed, decent handling, and pretty decent boost, this is definitely up there as one of the better ones, and like I said, falls into probably being my second favourite of the entire pack. It's definitely better than the SpecTyte, it's definitely better than the Carbide, but it's just not quite as good as the RD09, which is, to be honest, absolutely phenomenal. So overall, is this a pack that's probably worth your time? I'd certainly say yes. The RD09 is absolutely fantastic, Rollin Thunder's great, SpecTyte is okay, but the Carbide for me just lets it down. Maybe someone that has a different opinion on that and probably absolutely loves that thing, but overall I'd say 3 out of 4 of these cars are good to very, very good or even phenomenal, but you know, just let down by 1. Decent pack, really enjoyed my time with them, and I'm definitely going to be using these cars into the future.